The war in Ukraine continues to escalate. NATO is sending more troops eastward. Russia is once again accused of violating NATO airspace. And Ukraine has endured some of the heaviest drone strikes of the entire conflict. At the same time, Ukraine is striking back, targeting Russian oil refineries and energy infrastructure. So the question remains, what has happened to the diplomatic push to end this war? Hello and welcome. I'm Tom McRae, and this is Inside the Story. There has been no let-up in the war between Russia and Ukraine. Over recent weeks, we've seen some of the most intense Russian drone strikes since the invasion began. Entire cities in Ukraine have been forced into blackout. Civilian areas are hit repeatedly. Meanwhile, Ukraine has shifted its strategy, repeatedly targeting Russian energy facilities, oil refineries, pipelines, and key infrastructure. Just a month ago, the headlines were about diplomacy. US President Donald Trump met Vladimir Putin in Alaska, then hosted Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky and European leaders in Washington. The expectation then was that peace talks could begin. But today, the focus is back on the skies. Estonia has become the latest NATO member to accuse Russia of violating its airspace. Trump has threatened Russia with new sanctions for failing to take steps toward peace. But so far, there are no sanctions, no negotiations, only more war. Russia is now accused of violating the airspace of a third NATO member state in just 2 weeks. Estonia says Russian fighter jets flew into its territory and stayed for 12 minutes. During that time, NATO's Baltic air policing mission repeatedly ordered the jets to leave. Estonia's foreign minister says Russia is deliberately testing boundaries. Only days earlier, Poland endured a full-scale drone attack involving 19 drones. All were intercepted. Romania, too, was forced to scramble jets and instruct citizens to take shelter until a Russian drone left its skies. Moscow denies all of this. Russian officials insist their planes were flying through neutral territory. But Estonia is not convinced. It believes these incursions are meant to draw Western resources away from Ukraine, draining money, weapons and attention. NATO has responded by boosting its presence. France, Denmark, Germany and the UK have all sent additional aircraft and equipment to the eastern flank. A British official confirmed, "We've sent a Typhoon and a Voyager to support NATO missions in the eastern flank." And of course, we are in close contact with both Poland and Estonia. This is a very serious breach. It's potentially a serious escalation. While NATO deals with Russian provocations, Ukraine is facing its own storm. Russia has launched some of its heaviest drone attacks yet. One strike sparked a massive fire in Zaporizhzhia. For its part, Ukraine is escalating too, targeting Russian refineries and energy hubs with growing intensity. The timing is no coincidence. These strikes follow the Alaska summit between Trump and Putin, where Trump insisted on direct talks between Putin and Zelensky. He warned of more sanctions if talks didn't happen, but no discussions took place. No sanctions were added. Instead, the battlefield grew even bloodier. To unpack these developments, we turn to three voices. Chris Weir, CEO of Macro Advisory, speaking from Moscow. Stephen Erlanger, Chief Diplomatic Correspondent in Europe for the New York Times, joining from Berlin. And Peter Zelniv, Executive Director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative, speaking from Kiev. Chris Weir believes Russia's actions are retaliation. Ukraine's attacks on Russian energy infrastructure, he says, have been more effective than acknowledged publicly. The Kremlin treats output damage as a state secret, but the strikes have clearly disrupted refineries. Weir explains, on the one hand, Russia is retaliating in whatever way it can, increasing pressure on the population and hoping that forces Kyiv authorities to reduce attacks on refineries. At the same time, Russia is aware of shifting public opinion in Ukraine. Polls show more Ukrainians now prefer peace over endless fighting. Weir continues, the attacks on Kyiv are possibly a crude way of increasing that pressure and hoping that public opinion increases more. But beyond the battlefield, he points to diplomacy that continues quietly. Even after Alaska, there have been lower-level engagements between US and Russian officials. Moscow, he says, has always insisted it will only negotiate directly with Washington, not with Kyiv or the EU. From Berlin, Stephen Erlanger looks at NATO's reaction. He stresses that this is fundamentally a NATO issue, not an EU one, since 23 of the 27 EU members are also NATO members. He says NATO is unified, but the incursions reveal vulnerabilities, especially against drone warfare. Erlanger explains Poland believes that the 21 drones that went over its territory were intentional. They were all fired from the same place in Russia, which was different from the site used to fire drones over Ukraine. He describes the Estonian incident as unusually long. 12 minutes in NATO skies tested the alliance's response. Some in NATO are already saying that next time Russia does that, we should shoot them down, he adds. From Kyiv, Peter Zelniv says Ukrainians are dissatisfied with NATO's limited response. Most Ukrainians believe that Putin will continue with these. An attack on NATO will not come in a too obvious fashion. One can argue that Russia is already engaged in a full-scale, albeit hybrid aggression against NATO, he warns. For Zelniv, Putin's goal is clear: to weaken NATO's Article 5, the principle that an attack on one member is an attack on all. Without it, he says, NATO's credibility would be destroyed. Back to the ground realities. In Ukraine, polls reveal shifting attitudes. A Gallup survey from July found nearly 70% of Ukrainians favour a negotiated end to the war. Only 24% said the fight should continue until total victory. That is the reverse of opinion at the start of the war. Stephen Erlanger puts it plainly. Of course, people are tired of the war. Of course, they want a negotiated solution, but they want a fair one. They don't want capitulation to Russia. Peter Zelniv agrees. While fatigue is real, surrender is not an option. But he warns morale is slipping, not only because of losses, but also because of perceived US disengagement. Only 20% of Ukrainians consider that America is pulling its weight and doing right by its allies, including Ukraine, he says. Without consistent US backing, Zelniv fears Ukraine could face a Georgian scenario where Russia gains influence through political means rather than outright occupation. Despite the bleak picture, Chris Weir insists quiet diplomacy continues between Washington and Moscow. US Senator Marco Rubio has hinted that talks are underway behind closed doors. The discussions include not just Ukraine, but also arms control, security guarantees, and even energy cooperation. Weir says Donald Trump does have the ability to bring an end to this war. He could significantly ratchet up sanctions on Russian oil exports, or he could threaten to withdraw military support for Ukraine. Stephen Erlanger adds that Trump's approach so far is to push Europe to take more responsibility, often by purchasing American-made weapons. Trump, Erlanger says, has no intention of abandoning battlefield intelligence support, which remains critical to Ukraine's defense. But he also doubts Trump will impose fresh sanctions on Putin. Russia, for its part, is reportedly offering Trump deals, reviving Nord Stream 2, rare earth supplies, and energy cooperation, all aimed at appealing to Trump, the businessman. So what happens next? From Kyiv, Peter Zelniv predicts the most realistic outcome in the next 6 to 12 months is simply a continuation of hostilities. Ukraine, he says, is preparing to wage asymmetrical warfare, increasing its drone production and striking Russian refineries to raise the costs of war for Moscow. Chris Weir emphasizes the long-term damage being done to both countries, but especially Russia. The longer the war continues, the more long-term damage it does to Russia's ability to recover, he concludes. The picture is stark. Russia continues its provocations in NATO skies. Ukraine endures relentless drone bombardment while striking back at Russia's energy heart. NATO is reinforcing its eastern flank, but its credibility is being tested. Diplomacy between Washington and Moscow quietly moves forward, but so far the bombs and drones speak louder than words. For Ukrainians, the war is exhausting, yet the idea of surrender remains unthinkable. For Russia, the strategy is clear. Keep testing, keep pressuring, and keep waiting for Western unity to fracture. As for Donald Trump, his role remains pivotal. He can escalate sanctions, he can cut support, or he can keep the status quo. Either way, his decisions in Washington may shape the future of Ukraine more than any battlefield in Europe. For now, the war shows no signs of ending, and the world is left wondering, will diplomacy return, or will this conflict drag on indefinitely? I'm Tom McRae. This has been Inside the Story.